Yes, welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today we're going to talk about England. We've covered events in the 17th century in France, Louis XIV, now the same we have to do for England. Very dramatic events in England. This is the time of the English Revolution. This is the time of the first execution of the king, uh, to be followed in France. This is the most perhaps dramatic social revolution in modern times, starts in England. So we have to go through very complex political and social and religious situation in England to understand who is who and what really happened. So as a short introduction, basically we left England at the time of Elizabeth, which was probably one of the good times. This was the late 1500s. This is the time of prosperity, peace. England avoids the religious wars as were raging in France in 1500s. England emerges victorious from the confrontation with Spanish Armada, which basically puts England on the path of a maritime power in the 1580s. Um, and essentially, at the time of devastation, first by religious wars in France and then by the 30 Years' War in Europe, England stays out of it most of the time, and it sort of succeeds to keep the peace. But then dramatic events do come to England, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So Elizabeth was childless, and after her, the king was James the First of England, and at the same time James the Sixth of Scotland. So he was both. He was Scottish and English at the same time, and he had basically. By the way, the first ship that goes to America in 1608, they found a colony called Jamestown. That's because of James. So this is the first time the English are actually venturing out to America and established the very, very first settlement in 1608. So that's why Jamestown, James. James had ideas of divine right kings. He certainly believes that his mission is to be a divine right king. He certainly believes in his mission to unite uh, England and Scotland, as he himself is both a king of England and a king of Scotland. Now, this is difficult because to you and to everybody who is not English, it would sound like weird differences, small differences between Calvinists, who Presbyterians in Scotland, and Anglicans in England. That they're both Protestants, so what's the big deal? They both don't like the Pope. They're both Protestant churches, and yet it's not really a matter of religious belief. I think it's a matter of national identity. The Scottish don't really want to become English, and that is why the religious differences acquires a kind of a political dimension. His dream of uniting the two is not going to work, even to the present day. Scotland is Scotland. Yes, it's a united kingdom, but this is a different people with a different identity and self-rule as of now. Now, James didn't accomplish much, but he at least avoided war. Maybe that's what his most important accomplishment. But in 1625, his son comes to power, and his name is Charles, known in history as Charles the First. He carries on with the same dream as his father to unite England and Scotland. And of course, he feels himself much more English already because he's been born of an English king and Scottish. So he keeps pretty much the both identities. And again, he's going to try to do the same as his father to unify the two kingdoms into one. Now, a kind of we will go over it in a chronological order, but if you remember, we mentioned in the previous videos the War of 1627. In 1627, England sent an army to help the Huguenots in La Rochelle. So this is the episode when England did participate in the 30 Years' War, but not very much. Basically, it was under the command of Buckingham, and Buckingham lost, and the English withdrew. But the reason this is important is because the Parliament, for some reason, detested Buckingham and wanted to impeach him, which is kind of already puts the king in a confrontation mode with the Parliament, because Charles wants to defend Lord Buckingham, and the Parliament wants to dismiss him, and that's 1627. Uh, the English lost, they withdrew, they did not participate anymore in the 30 Years' War. The Huguenots were defeated, the Huguenots were crushed, so we know all that story. But for the English politics, this is the first defeat, political defeat of Charles I. And now comes the really big stuff, and that's called the Petition of Right. I all urge you to read it. It's very easily searchable, Petition on Right on Google. It's a document of 2 pages, and it's extremely important because it shows a revolution in the brewing. I mean, it's going to happen, but you could see it already in the Petition of Right. So let me explain briefly what is in the Petition of Right. Well, Petition of Right is a petition, which means it's a request, a very polite one, by the members of Parliament to the king, and it is in the form of, we request such and such to be done, and we don't like this and that. So it lists grievances of the members of Parliament, against the king. Now, let's just be very clear what English Parliament is, because that when the revolution does happen, we have to understand what changed. English Parliament is similar to Parlement in France, but it's different. It is similar in that the landowners own all the seats in the Parliament, and they defend their right. What's different is that it's landowners of whatever title. A merchant could buy land and get himself a seat in the Parliament. So there's no kind of class division. It's whoever owns the land has a seat in the Parliament. And it would cause big trouble later on when others would want to join in. And they do pay taxes. That's the difference with France. They do pay taxes. And they have a House of Lords, and the House of Lords is hereditary. So the richest families of the lords have always been, and their firstborn becomes a lord and gets a seat in the Parliament. So it's a different system. You have the House of Commons, which is all landlords and some people from the cities, and they are paying taxes. All of them do. However, they pay taxes, but they have to approve the king's expenditure. And that is the key difference. The class composition is similar, except that there's not only the birth ones, but also the English Parliament does have control of the purse, as it is called, does have control of the money that is raised through the taxation. However, it is not a legislative institution. This is the key importance that makes it similar to the Parlement. They are not a parliament in the modern sense. They are not making laws. No, they are not making laws. They are a collection agency for taxation. That's what they do. They raise money through taxes from all of the people of England, and they approve the spending, which means that if a king goes to war, the money has to be raised through the Parliament for the national defense, and they have to approve it and give it to him. So that's the difference. That makes it similar to a legislative institution in a sense that they control the money, but they don't make any laws. The king does. The king declares wars. The king leads the army. He's the commander-in-chief. He actually can pass any law at will. And if we recall the rule of Henry VIII, he pretty much executed anybody he wanted, including his wives, and including Thomas More, who was a bishop. So there was an actually unlimited monarchy under Henry VIII. in a sense like l'état c'est moi. The king could do whatever he pleased. And that was a part of English tradition. It was a part of English history. So, what do they say in 1628 Petition of Right? They say basically that no one can put out anybody out of his lands without the parliamentary consent. Now that is a very interesting proposition, because people were put out of their lands by Charles and by his predecessors, and of course by Henry VIII. No taxation without parliament approval. Well, that's an interesting idea, but that's been done before too. So they're kind of trying to assert their power over the taxation process and over property rights. And that they have a big stake in, because indeed some of these issues are echoes from the Magna Carta, which was the first time that the English nobility put conditions about their property and their privileges to the king for the first time in 1215. No loans, they say, could be imposed on the people of England without the Parliament consent. Again, the kings used to do it, including Charles and all the preceding ones, that they would need a loan, then they would put it on somebody, and they would provide this because the king wants it. No quartering of troops should be allowed to private property, to some estates, without the approval of the Parliament. No one can be imprisoned without the due process of law. That does echo the Magna Carta, and that's of course it's been done to wives and bishops and others under Henry VIII and all other kings. People were imprisoned at will without the Parliament consent, but now they say you need a Parliament consent. Nobody could be put to death without the due process of law, says the Parliament in the Petition of Right, in accord with ancient laws and privileges. But of course, the point is that this was done as well. So, just like the French Parlement, the Parliament in England asks politely the king to respect old traditions and privileges. It sounds like a very similar language to what happened in France in 1648. Old traditions and privileges. And the English have more of a right to say that, because you can find some of these propositions in the Magna Carta. But the point is, Magna Carta was like 400 years ago, and many kings broke all kinds of rules of Magna Carta many times over, the glaring example being Henry VIII. And so, in a sense, they are introducing something new in the guise as if it is old. But that is the reality in England. A very interesting thing is the response of the king to the Petition of Right. Usually people just read the Petition of Right, but then don't look at his response. The response is extremely interesting. It shows actually that Charles I is a very clever man, very educated man, a politician that can speak about history and precedent and law and the rules of the Parliament, that he actually knows what he's talking about if we read his response. His response to the Petition of Right, basically, is that the Parliament had always been an advisory institution, which implies that the king is free to do whatever he pleases. They can submit their petition, but the king is free to accept or not accept their requests, which by implication means that they know that he can do whatever he wants. He can impose loans, he can declare war, he can raise money for the war, he can imprison traitors, he can even order execution of the enemies of the state. All of that has been done and is a part of tradition, he says, just as much as the ancient privileges of nobility are a part of tradition. So he has a very clever response to them, basically saying, look, everything that you accuse me of doing has been done by others before me, and I don't see any reason why I shouldn't be doing that either. The second concern of the Parliament was that Charles married a French woman. She was a Catholic, and her name was Henrietta Bourbon. And that meant, from the point of view of the parliament, that the kids may be Catholic because she's Catholic. And that's a nightmare for the British elite, to have a Catholic heir to the throne who knows, might restore Catholicism. And that would be, of course, devastation from their point of view. Let's just briefly, we'll finish on that in a minute, review the religious situation in England, why they're so afraid of a Catholic heir to the throne. England has a very complicated religious situation, much more complicated than in France, where you had Catholics and Huguenots. That's it, just two. In England, you have, in England proper, you had the official Anglican Church, which is also not quite clear what it is, because it kept changing through the 16th century. And in the rule of Edward, it became more Protestant. It became more bare of relics and rituals, and it appeared to be more Protestant in the way it looked and in the way the procedures were. But at the same time, it did keep the bishops, the structure, the privileges, the freedom from taxation. It had a lot of elements of it, just exactly as the Catholics, except no Pope. In other words, during Henry VIII, it was pretty much like the Catholic Church without the Pope. Then it became much more Protestant under Edward. But Elizabeth's policy for all these years was pretty much to keep it from being too much either of those, because she wanted to keep peace. She wanted to preserve the country, and she succeeded in doing that. So the English church was never like a fully Protestant, like the Calvinists or Anabaptists would want it, but it was still obviously not a Catholic church. Now, that means that the new trend that appeared, which we began to study under the influence of Thomas More, you have a new element, which is called the Puritans, and they're becoming more and more numerous. And in 1622, a ship of Puritans leaves for America because they are not comfortable in England of Charles, well, at that time of James. And they establish a new colony in Massachusetts, where you have the brotherhood of the Christian brothers and sisters in Christ. They want to create a new community of believers who are pure, who are Puritans, who are genuinely Protestant. And Anglican Church for them is not Protestant enough. So within the Protestants, you actually have, in England proper, you have Anglicans and you have Puritans. And then you'll have even more radical ones, but that's later down the road, the Levelers during the Civil War. In Scotland, you basically have Calvinists who are called Presbyterians. And in Ireland, you have staunch Catholics. And the English crown owns all of it. It is de facto United Kingdom. You have a king who is English and Scottish, and the English own Ireland. And therefore you have very, very tense situation in religion. And each of those groups is very, very nervous about who is going to get the power and which way the religion is going to move, as it would blow out into a full-fledged civil war. And on that note, we can finish today. Do not forget to put your likes and to subscribe to AP European History with Dr. Brock.